Thank you guys so much. I am super honored and excited to be your plenary speaker for Plot-A-Thon 2026. I normally don't really have the opportunity to speak to, people that aren't game design students and things like that. So this is a new experience for me as well. Let me start with sharing my screen. I've prepared some slides for this presentation. And there we go. Can you guys see my screen okay? Cool. So, games and data. Um, like mentioned earlier, I'm Rika Nishikawa. I am lead content designer at Skydance Interactive, a video game company. And I want to start off by introducing myself to you guys a little bit. I am a lead content designer, and that's a very specific way to word it, but essentially, I am a game designer. For those of you who are not familiar, game designers are kind of like the architect of video game development. Um, we go in defining mechanics and systems that create a game, and we are kind of the stewards that help pull the entire game development team into creating the overall player experience. Um, some of the notable games I've worked on, I've been in the industry for over, gosh, 12 years now. I don't want to age myself too much here, but some of the notable games I've worked on that you guys may have heard of is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, The Walking Dead, Saints and Sinners, Shantae, Half Genie Heroes, and so forth. If any of you guys are interested in kind of looking at the things that I do professionally, but also the personal stuff I do have a game design portfolio, which you can find the link here. And I like to describe myself as very curious and greedy for knowledge, of course. And that's kind of a running theme as I kind of go through the journey that I've been through so far with you guys to start off. My education is from California Institute of the Arts, BFA in character animation. So I started off in animation. I gravitated towards that because I have a love of everything art related, music and drawing and art and theater. And I was so greedy that I couldn't give up any of those. And I was trying to decide to where to go for college. And at the time, I said, hey, animation involves all of those things. And it's kind of an amalgam of all of those different arts. And so I started off when I graduated as a game animator in the industry. I am now an ex-animator, as you can tell from my job title. But I spent about 6 years starting off as an animator and working up all the way to being a lead animator on some of the projects I've worked on. That said, I was endlessly curious. So even in my role as a game animator, I would often reach out to parts of the game development pipeline that came before and came after me. So I would dip my toes into learning about technical animation and tech art and learn about how the characters that we animate in games are rigged with bones and connections that let us actually animate them. I also then extended into the parts that come after the work of an animator, which is getting it working in the game, how those animations are exported and imported, how that is interpreted in the game engine, how we set them up using things like state machines, which are like true false webs of what animation to play and when, things like that. And throughout that process, I found my calling in game design. I had the opportunity on this game, The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, to design a little interaction where we were trying to figure out how to make zombies, the walkers, interact with NPCs in the background, and essentially kind of go through to a grapple and how that interaction would play out to make the world feel real and make the player feel like they were in a zombie apocalypse. And being able to design that small portion of the game, I found that I was the most fulfilled I'd been ever. And I think what really called to me is, I mentioned that I'm very greedy, and I thought that animation was an amalgamation of all the different things like, sound and music and drawing and writing and theater. And I noticed that in games, when you design, you throw in the player, and it's a kind of interaction where we invite the audience into the actual work that we're creating. And I felt like that was a step further into the things that I enjoyed and that I found passion in. So while being an animator, I self-studied for 3 years. I read a ton of books. I was building skills through finding tutorials online and reading up other game developers' vlogs and their paths through this process, and then making my own games and prototypes. And I worked on those skills before making the jump. Thankfully, my efforts came to fruition and I was able to jump into game design. I was first a narrative technical designer for Jedi Survivor at Respawn Entertainment. And then when that project concluded, I then moved to Skydance Interactive, where I started as senior technical designer. And now I am happy to say that I am a lead content designer and lead a small team of content designers to help craft an overall player experience for the games that we are making there. So, into the meat of this talk, I want to talk about how data shapes games and how games shape data. I kind of have four major topics that I'm going to be covering with you guys today. And here's kind of just an overview of each of them. First, games collect data to find and understand players. Just like a book needs a reader, a movie needs an audience, games need a player. And we collect data from players both at the beginning and at the end and also during production. It helps us narrow down what game we're making and understand how the gameplay is landing with the players, or not in some cases. Second, the games use data to shape itself into enjoyable experiences. Games make use of data to measure whether gameplay is working as intended or not in the hands of players. Sometimes the answer to the question of why something is working is unexpected, which I'll go into talk about a little bit. And this is kind of the exciting part where the data, the objective, meets game feel, which is very subjective. And games provide data for scientific research. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about games and data, where I talk about the interesting ways that games can kind of step out of the bounds of just being entertainment. We think games are just entertainment, right? Wrong. There are a lot of really, really interesting cases where games have impacted the real world and everyday life by proving useful for scientific study. And games can be a really useful tool. And lastly, games give meaning to data and can become precious to players. This is one of my passion topics that I wanted to discuss with you guys and share with you guys. Data in the context of games can become something the player holds dear to their heart through games. Data itself can be used as a game mechanic that takes on a whole new meaning if treated that way in a game. And I think these are some of the most interesting uses of data that we make in game development. So first, games collect data to find and understand players. So game developers collect data to better understand their players and answer a lot of important questions like who are our players and what do they enjoy? That's actually pretty relevant to you guys. And in this Plot-A-Thon, the data set that you guys are working with this year is a lot of this information here. Also things like how long should the game be per session? And then also overall, how long is the entire game? How many of our players want to spend money and then how much? That directly plugs into what is our budget for this game? How many people can we have on our game dev team? And then also, how will our game do when it's in the hands of our players? What tech limitations do our game have? Where can we reduce them? Where do we pump up the quality? Where are our players failing? What mechanics are our players enjoying? And are our players experiencing what we intended? There are a lot of different metrics and types of data that we collect in game development, and I've kind of listed 4 examples here. I'm sure there's more ways to break this down into more minute things, but these are just the general ones that come up the most often. The first is engagement metrics. Who is our target audience? What kind of games do they enjoy? What is their age? Which kind of determines things like how much time do they have to play our game? Are they gamers or are they newbies? What are they kind of looking for in a game experience? Are they looking for something casual, chilled, and laid back, or something intense and fun and adrenaline pumping? This shapes the very early decisions of what kind of game do we want to make. And that's usually because it's a bad idea to make a game that includes everything from the get-go. It'll be way too much, and we'll be asking our players to learn way too many things and spreading themselves thin. So the engagement metrics help us in the very early decisions of which target audience we want to narrow down to and who is our core audience for the game that we're making. Monetization metrics. What do our players spend money on? Um, this is important from my point of view as a game developer, not because I want our game to be successful and make millions and millions, but it goes directly into decisions that really shape how much time we have and how many people we can have on our team for the game that we're making. And that determines things like, like what's the quality that we are able to hit, or, how many different characters can the player interact with? How big or small is our game going to be? What are the kind of, cheats and smoke and mirrors that we may have to use or not use? Then there's also always the performance metrics. If you have a game, but you can't play it without your computer setting itself on fire, it's not a very good game. And so we always look at things like, where are the bottlenecks that are happening? Where are the points in our game where the frame rate drops? What's the frame rate that's comfortable for a player to play in? That's a very important one as well. And we gather data on where that's happening and then also why that's happening so that we can make decisions like, where do we need to reduce the number of things we're doing? Or in other cases, where are places where we still have a lot of wiggle room in terms of the performance so we can kind of pump up the quality? And then finally, and I guess this is kind of the bread and butter for a game designer like myself, the gameplay metrics. What are our players, doing in the game? Sorry, it says going, but it's doing in the game. Where are our players dying, for example? How many times are they dying? What kind of equipment do they have when they're dying? Or, where are our players succeeding? How long does it take them to them to clear a level? Or how many of the players go route A versus route B? This all kind of boils down into what game designers are most interested in, which is, are players really able to experience the game that we intended in the way that we intended? Now, games use data to shape itself to, I said enjoyable, but I want to replace that word with intended experiences. We gather data from playtests, gameplay metrics, and other feedback to hone in on the intended experience of a game. Um, and I don't know if any of you guys know Markiplier, the YouTuber. He does Let's Plays. Here's a gif of him having a very visceral reaction to something that he came across in a game. And this gif is actually why I nixed the word enjoyable and I replaced it with intended. Some games are not supposed to be enjoyable. Some games are supposed to be frustrating. Horror games are supposed to be terrifying. And so it's all about boiling down and shaping games where we let the player experience what we want them to. A lot of the times that's fun, and a lot of the times that's enjoyment. Sometimes it's drama. Sometimes it's, frustration, and then hopefully getting over that frustration and that feeling that comes afterwards. I have a couple of examples that I would like to share, which I think are good ways to describe how we use data. And sometimes it's one-to-one, and then sometimes it's a little bit more of like subjective detective work. One of the games that I worked on, a VR game called Skydance's Behemoth, for example, we were getting data and feedback that while some players were struggling with parrying enemy melee attacks. So the enemies would come at you and you were supposed to parry them by hitting the swinging sword coming in. We realized that the players were not quite getting to the level of mastery of that mechanic that we were hoping to, which would open them up to really enjoy our combat system. And so in response to that data and feedback, we created a patch that we launched shortly after that took a multi-pronged approach to the problem. We first did the first thing that came to mind, which is we made the parry allowance more forgiving. What I mean by that is we had a system where the enemies would swing the sword at you at an angle, and we would try to determine if the player swung their sword at it at more or less a perpendicular angle to the incoming attack. And we had numbers that controlled how much of a deviation of an angle we would allow for that. So we made that way more forgiving. That improved the experience quite a bit, but we also noticed that that wasn't quite enough. The forgiveness was great, but we noticed that the players, not all players were really parsing that the intent was for you to try and match the incoming swing perpendicularly. And so we also went back and modified the tutorial that we had in game of the parry for the text to read better and to present itself a lot more front and foremost to the player. And also we added a supplemental image to make the intended action clearer. A picture speaks 1,000 words essentially. And so the image made it a lot clearer of like, oh, like they want this kind of action happening. I'd also like to borrow from the experiences of other game developers and other games. I think this one is kind of a famous example in the games industry about how some of the problems that we come across and the data that presents itself, the solution isn't what the first thing that you kind of expect. It's talking about shotgun satisfaction. In a first-person shooter game by producer Matt Powers, he worked on games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty. He was getting feedback that said the shotgun in the game was feeling so underpowered compared to the other guns in the game. This was an interesting problem because numerically, in terms of like how much damage the shotgun did and things like that per shot, if anything, it was a little overpowered compared to all the other weapons in the game. And so trying a number of things, a solution that they ended up taking in this game was actually giving the shotgun a sound with a sharper punch. And it was just the audio that they replaced. They didn't touch the numbers of the damage that it did or how many bullets it fired and things like that. They just added a more satisfying sound to the shotgun. And with that, the feedback improved without any numerical tweaking. It's kind of a thing where you sometimes feel like a doctor, where the patient comes in with symptoms, and you kind of take that constellation of symptoms and try to work your way backwards towards the cause and find a solution for it. If any of you want to read deeper into that, here is the original article that Matt Powers wrote about the experience, and it's a great read. Um, And then I want to also give an example from the Star Wars Jedi Survivor game that I worked on. This isn't a part that I directly work on, but it is one of the favorite parts of the game that I came across, and it's Rick the Door Technician. It's quite a funny experience here. And here's a little video interview. Actually, do you guys hear the audio from the video that's playing? Just wanted to double check. Okay. Hope you guys do. Cool. So this is the director of Jedi Survivor talking about this, Rick the Door Technician.
There's things that like surprise me when playing the game that like nobody ever talked to me about. One of my favorites is Rick the Door Technician.
Yes, I was hoping to talk about that. Yes, for me that is best boss fight of 2023 so far.
Yeah, that was one of those moments for me. It's like I didn't know it was in the game, and you know, there's that brutal fight that you have like kind of on the base of the hangar that goes on and on and on. Most people got there with like barely any health left, and they see this boss bar come up, and they're like, "Holy hell, what is?" When we do the focus test, we actually have a camera on the player, and one of the guys, it's priceless. Rick the Door Technician starts coming towards us. He kind of runs backwards for a minute. He's trying to size up what's going on. And then he goes in and just takes him down with one hit. And the guy starts cracking up and he falls out of the chair. There's things that.
Yeah, so this is a moment in our game that was kind of a joke moment that we snuck in. And I wanted to bring this up as an example because I think it's a moment that is crafted by balancing the experience based on data to get it just right so that the joke lands. As Stig, the director, kind of explained here, the game almost guarantees that the player at this point is low on health, is desperate for a save point. They've used up all of their, their health recoveries and all of that, and follows that up with one last surprise boss fight, Rick the Door Technician, who is felled by one hit. And I don't think this joke would land the same way without the play-tested data supporting this experience for many players. Stig mentioned, focus groups where we would videotape the player's reaction. You also track the game that they're playing and kind of what kind of inputs that they're having, while also recording the game screen and gather data on that. If you guys want to go deeper into it, there's an article here by IGN that kind of goes into it as well. Now, this, I think, is this next topic, games providing data for scientific research. I think this is a really, really interesting way that we use games that are entertainment, but also not just for entertainment. We look at the data that it provides and also how the medium that is games really can draw a lot out from the human experience and then take that and put it to good use. So it's not just entertainment. There are games that are just for fun. They can be, but they can also be much more. And there are a lot of cases where they've impacted the real world, everyday life. And I want to talk to you about how, and I guess like games are really useful here because they harness the power of human behavior in a game and then also the collaboration on a scale that's really hard to achieve in any other medium. One of the famous ones is the corrupted blood incident in World of Warcraft. This was a bug in a very popular MMORPG, World of Warcraft, and it became a source of data for studying behavior in response to a pandemic situation. I think pandemic COVID-19 is still very fresh in a lot of our minds, and it's not often that we get a lot of data from those kind of situations that really impact a lot of people, a lot of health, and surprised that there was actually a case where something very, very similar happened in this MMORPG where we have a ton of players playing a game. A quick summary of what happened is they introduced a new boss fight in the World of Warcraft where there was a debuff or a negative effect that the boss could apply to players, and it was contained to just within that boss fight. It was a boss fight specific gimmick. What the developers didn't realize is that when players summoned, I guess you could call them pets or companions during the boss fight and they put them away, the companion characters that the players had would also contract this debuff. But because they were put away before the end of the boss fight, even though the players successfully had the debuffs taken away from them, the companions that they have never got the opportunity to get the debuff cleared from them. And so when players would come out of the boss fight and as they were going around and they'd summon their companions again, their companions contained the debuff. And then that debuff would spread like a disease to the player and other players in their vicinity. This was such an interesting case to look at because of how players reacted to the pandemic. Some players would go out of their way to go help players by trying to heal them and things like that. This is how some other players would decide to go grief. They knew that they'd contracted it and they'd purposely go to places where there were a lot of other players and see if they can wreak havoc. It's also interesting to look at how it spread relative to population density. Some players tried to go to places where there weren't a lot of players around to see if it would help their case. And also just this kind of accidental simulation of symptomatic carriers versus asymptomatic carriers. Players that had the debuff and the bug outright would be symptomatic carriers, but players that didn't have it but had their companion pretty much stowed away and out of sight would be asymptomatic carriers because they had the bug, but they just weren't symptomatic and they hadn't released it yet. That and of course the efforts to eradicate the spread in a world where each player had free will by the developers was also an interesting study as well. They tried wiping certain parts of the game to eradicate it altogether and found that sometimes it just scripted back because all it took was one player that still had the bug from another section come into there. There is an entire wiki on this incident, and the wiki, of course, at the bottom has a bunch of different papers that were written based off of this. And so it's a very fantastic read and a really, really interesting study. The other one that I love to talk about here is this game called Fold It. It's a game that was created by the University of Washington, and it was deliberately made as an experiment. But it's a real game. It's like a puzzle game that players can play. And what this game did was it allowed the University of Washington to crowdsource protein folding. Um, it essentially allowed players to attempt to fold proteins in the most efficient way possible and treated it like a puzzle game for the players. But then they took high scoring attempts from the players, and the researchers went in and analyzed those attempts and looking at the any patterns in how they were folding it or the folded shape and whether it's something that they could recreate in real life. And this it actually contributed to helping solve scientific problems that algorithms struggled with. And so this is a really intriguing and fascinating case of, using games as a way to crowdsource solutions and harnessing human ingenuity through a game. If you are interested to see which specific examples that were made use of in real life examples, the wiki here probably has the most exhaustive list of the different use cases that they've had. So And then finally, this is my favorite topic. Games give meaning to data and can become precious to players. Um, I don't know how much games you guys play, but I wonder if you've ever had an experience of having gotten really upset over losing progress in a game, or this is from personal experience, or but had a fight with a sibling over getting save data erased or overwritten. Um, Data becomes precious to a player and gains meaning if they allow it in a game. I have two examples that I'd like to share with you here. One is a game called Alien Isolation. It's a horror game based off of the Alien franchise, of course. And it's interesting because when they were developing this game, they were, they automatically resorted to using automatic save. So you just walk around in the game, pretty much invisibly keep saving the game for you, so you don't lose progress. And in most games, in most situations, that's a good thing. But the developers on this game realized that it just didn't make the game scary anymore. Because let's say the alien got you and you died, right? You'd be able to go back to, I don't know, like possibly a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes because of the auto save system. And so you weren't really losing anything when you were, failing essentially in the games. And so they made an interesting decision of instead ripping out the auto save and falling back to old school manual saves that were actual locations in the level that were hand placed by the game developers. Um, they also even amped it up by making it take some time for you to save your games, but wasn't an immediate thing that could happen. And so the developers on Alien Isolation, they use the sparsity of save points and purposefully made saving be really clumsy and take time to amp up the fear felt by the player in this Alien game because the save data became an analog for survival to the player through this game design. And that's because save data is precious to a player and it represents more than data. Um, the second example I have is from one of my most favorite games of all time, Nier Automata. I apologize, it is a little bit spoilery so that I can kind of convey the point to you, but there is a section at the very end of the game. It's quite dramatic. You are being pummeled by walls of bullets. If you could kind of see here, this little triangle here is the player, and those little white rods are your bullets, versus all these orange and red circles here, they are the enemy bullets, and they're moving towards you in different patterns and things. And as you can see from this screen, it's quite overwhelming. Pretty much the whole screen is covered by enemy bullets. So you are being pummeled by them, and it seems impossible to beat this shooting game on your own. When you are suddenly offered aid, the game asks you if you would like help. When you accept, you suddenly have these extra allies that come to your aid, extra planes essentially that also shoot bullets for you. They increase your firepower, and the battle is suddenly easier and achievable. There are names on these ally ships. The ships, just like you, they take damage, and then some are destroyed in this fight, only to be replaced by a new ship with a new name. Then, after the hard won victory, you are then asked as a player if you want to sacrifice your save data. This could be like, for me, was like 60 hours of gameplay. And if you want to sacrifice that to help others in need, just like they did for you. Those ally ships were the save data of other players that came before you, sacrificed to help you. They actually had their save data deleted and wiped in exchange for getting a little ship that their username would appear on that can appear in another player's playthrough that comes after you. I love this because this mechanic makes data feel like connections to other players, and it lets the player experience the kindness of strangers. And I think that's a really powerful use of data. Now, since you guys are in Plot-A-Thon, I did want to kind of cover um, how and why to visualize data for games. To be very frank and honest, game developers are stressed at best, running on fumes and Red Bull at worst. But visualization helps cut through that hectic development environment. And so we need to gather data and act on it to improve the game for our players. And visualization really helps with that, especially because games contend with a lot of data and a lot of types of data to begin with. This image up here is actually a photo I took from one of the books I have from that game, Near Automata. They released um, essentially their data book. And you can see here in this case, they visualized characters from players to enemies and the different numbers that each of those enemies came with, whether it be their hit points and their attacks, their defense, um, and experience points, if those are rewarded, and how those compared to one another. And seeing it here with this little image of the characters is much easier to parse than, for example, having just text spreadsheets, for example. Um, in game development, you might be wondering how we collect data and things like that. Most of the time, we attach flags to events that we want to track, whether that be player deaths or player stats at a certain point in the game, like when the player goes into this room, how much health do they have, what equipment do they have, what kind of upgrades have they gotten, things like that. We do make use of spreadsheets both to collect data and also make data in game development, assigning and balance everything from economies to enemies, like in this example here. And then in terms of visualization, we create tons of documents to make sure communication is clear across the entire team. And we're always trying to innovate on how to make documentation that's easier on the eyes and presents information in a way that's easier to parse. I myself, as a game designer, don't deal all that often with the data side of things, but even then, I've experimented with how to present data in a way to my team that's a lot easier to understand. Because I come from an animation background and I can draw, I use lots of images in my design documentation and sometimes animate things so that it's clear what it's happening and what we're doing. Um, Trying to make things interactive so that you can click on certain elements to have things pop up and be clearer. We also use a lot of charting, like loop charts, to describe how one thing feeds into another and creates a system in our games and how those systems interact. And we even try to visualize things like the story in terms of organizing the narrative tension and how that works, and how we try to kind of finagle with how do we keep our story for a game exciting and also engaging and not tire the player out. And the questions that I think we try to answer all the time and might be helpful for you guys going into Plot-A-Thon is what kind of data is useful to compare versus what is useful to categorize under one umbrella? And also, what amount of data is there? I think we would treat things like if there were only 10 elements that we were trying to track versus 1,000 elements, it would be very different in how we want to organize that data for the person that needs to process it. Um, and then the important thing is always keep in mind about what is the problem that we are trying to solve. And to solve that problem, what visual makes the data the easiest to parse for this purpose? And finally, that's pretty much all I have to talk about data for today. But if at any point in my talk you were, you were curious, or I piqued your interest about how to start a career in games, I want to give you a very quick and broad um, uh, summary of what I give as advice to budding game developers. I like to take all the endeavors that I interact that I take on, and I like to organize them into inputs and outputs because you need both for growth. Trying to do both at the same time can be overwhelming, so I like to separate my efforts out into today's an input day or this is an output day. Some examples of input that help are books. This image here is literally a photo of my bookshelf of all the different kind of game design related and game related books that I have studied using. YouTube is a wonderful, great, and free resource, and there's fantastic videos that are not just tutorials, but also going into dissecting games and understanding the design or understanding the process behind them. GDC talks, Game Developers Conference talks. This is wonderful because we invite a lot of professionals to give a talk about the things they know best. And there's just a ton of archived video footage of these talks that I found super helpful. They can go from something very broad to something very specific and specialized. So it's kind of you pick your poison. Dev blogs and dev vlogs are very useful as well. Getting a person's journey and understanding kind of the processes they went to, or getting specific examples of where they tripped up or where they worked through problems. And some of them may relate directly to you. The best one on here, of course, is play games. Playing games is input because you learn about the different choices that other people's made or find interesting cases like I've kind of described in this talk so far. And of course, if you make something, getting feedback on it is very important input. Get another person's point of view on it. It will help you shape what you're doing in a way that's very hard to do when you're kind of in your own bubble. Output, writing game design docs, jotting down kind of what you were trying to do. That's a fantastic way, starting to plan and starting to think about the different problems that you might start encountering when you're working on these. Even little chicken scratch sketches or kind of like the charts that I showed you earlier. Those are a form of output. Prototypes, of course. If you see in this GIF over here, this is actually a GIF where I recorded a video of a prototype that I made during the pandemic, actually. I was realizing that since we were remotely working and staying at home a lot, we would order a lot of food in because we just didn't have the time to cook. And that resulted in a lot of trash. And I said, well, like, I don't think I've played Trash Tetris as much as I've ever done in my life before until this. And so I made a game prototype where different choices led to different size um, trash that would get deposited in a little trash bin depending on the choices that you made here throughout your day. And you have to throw it into a trash can and try to finagle with it so that you can fit everything in from a week into these two trash bins here. And you also had one chance to use the squish trash button, which would reduce everything down into half. And so it would give yourself a little bit more wiggle room. Prototypes like this are great learning experiences because you learn more by doing, honestly. Making full games is also a fantastic way to learn. I participated in game jams to do so, which I found very helpful. It's very similar to Plot-A-Thon, actually, game jams, getting a limited amount of time to do something and make something. And so it's a great way to help you, help carry you from start to finish with a time limit ticking. And then kind of on the, to contrast it with the get feedback in the input section, give feedback. Giving feedback makes you look at others' work in a way that you wouldn't if you were just going to say, oh, like looking at it, oh, that looks cool. You have to actually think about their intent and what they try to do to hit that intent. And that process is a great learning process as well. It really gets your brain juices flowing and helps you become a better contributor. And if you want to become a better game developer. And lastly, finish your project. It's very easy, I think, to start something, but it can be very hard and takes a lot of discipline and commitment to finish them. And it's very important to do so because I found the most important lessons I've personally learned is from taking something, even a really small project, and taking it from start to finish. This image here is of a Trello board that I use to take myself through one of the games that I made for a game jam start to finish and the things that I had to learn that were out of my comfort zone. but very much related to the things that I need to do as a game developer day in and day out, has become a base for how I talk to my team and how I talk to others, and um, even just become a great way to kind of have a lot of information and experience on things that I wouldn't have had otherwise, if I was, working as a part of a game development team, because we tend to split up the work. But if it's your project and you finish it from beginning to end, there are so many things that you have to touch, and each one of them is a fantastic learning experience. Um, and to close things off, I'd like to kind of share my take on games and data, and kind of where I find it really inspiring to work with them. I think games are a medium where data, the objective, meets players, the subjective. So when you design a game with data-backed intent, an experience emerges and becomes something larger than the sum of its parts. And I think that's very magical. Thank you so much for having me as a plenary speaker. Good luck, and I hope you guys really enjoy Plot-A-Thon. I think we can open up to questions now.